Good afternoon. My name is Sean Kelly. I'm a professor here in the Department of Philosophy. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the second lecture in the 53rd series of the Alfred North Whitehead Lectures in Philosophy at Harvard University. As you heard yesterday with Professor Moran's introduction, this lecture series is named after one of the great philosophers who called our department home in the first half of the 20th century. Alfred North Whitehead retired from the philosophy department here at Harvard in 1937, having arrived from Imperial College, London, 13 years before. His influence on the students of our department was important, even if he was, as his obituary in the Harvard Crimson from 1948 states, quote, "For the majority of Harvard students, no more than a name uttered reverently in the comparative sanctity of seminar or professorial conference." Or they might more recently have added, "A face that stares down upon us all in the Bechtel room downstairs on the first floor." But Whitehead did influence the department strongly, at least through the influence that he had on W.V.O. Quine. Whitehead served as Quine's graduate supervisor in the department here, though admittedly that required less of a time commitment than normal since Quine took only 2 years to complete his PhD. But Whitehead was also, in a sense, Quine's grandfather, since he was, of course, a mentor to Bertrand Russell at Trinity College, Cambridge, and the famous Principia Mathematica that they wrote together was, of course, the subject of Quine's dissertation. It was fascinating to learn yesterday, therefore, that despite all this, Whitehead's influence in the 21st century is more likely to flow through the work of Gilles Deleuze. The Alfred North Whitehead Lectures began in 1957, and they've continued with some lapses during the 70s and 80s, pretty much annually since then. We're delighted to have included among our Whitehead Lectures such distinguished philosophers as Gilbert Ryle, Sir Peter Strawson, Philippa Foot, Sir Bernard Williams, Saul Kripke, David Lewis, Verity Hart, and many others. And we're especially delighted to welcome back to the podium today Professor Beatrice Longuenesse of New York University. Professor Longuenesse is the Silver Professor of Philosophy at NYU. You heard yesterday some of the impressive details not only of her pedigree, both in France and in the United States, but also of her intellectual output and her influence. I'm not going to repeat those, not least because my French pronunciation isn't going to stand up to Dick's from yesterday. But I will just remind you that Beatrice became famous in the US first in the late 1990s for her work on Kant and Hegel, and she's now universally regarded as one of the most prominent living experts on Kant. More recently, she spread out and developed influential positions in contemporary debates in the philosophy of mind and language. These projects, historical and systematic respectively, are of course related, as you will hear again today, since Beatrice's interpretation of the phenomena of self-consciousness and her position on contemporary issues related to the nature of consciousness and of the self are all heavily influenced by her reading of Kant. There's no doubt, therefore, that she's standing on the shoulders of a giant, but it's equally clear that she's adding in deep and important ways to the Kantian vision of the world. It's perhaps appropriate that I have the privilege to introduce Beatrice today, after Dick's wonderful introduction yesterday. Dick was able to tell you about the years he and Beatrice shared together at Princeton in the mid-1990s, and Beatrice and I were colleagues at Princeton shortly after that, from 1999 to 2004. As a young junior faculty member, me, in a department full of intensely smart and equally self-confident senior colleagues, I valued my friendship with Beatrice as highly as anything during my time there. I will never forget how, in the fall of 1999, during my first semester at Princeton, she came to hear my lectures on Heidegger's Being and Time. Now, Princeton was not, at that time, nor now, known for its friendliness to 20th century European philosophy or to the history of philosophy more generally. Indeed, it was only a short time earlier, during the Reagan era, that one of its most prominent faculty members was said to have posted on his office door a sign that said, "History of philosophy, just say no." So Beatrice's presence in my Heidegger lectures made a huge impression on me. She sat quietly in the room, off to the right, I remember, taking careful notes, thinking hard, smiling warmly, and occasionally asking questions which alternated between clarificatory and devastating. But it was a true intellectual presence, and it gave me the confidence to feel that what I was saying was worth listening to, and the certainty that in any case I was saying it among friends. When Beatrice left Princeton in 2004 to move to NYU, it was a great loss to the department in general, but to me in particular. Some years later, after I'd come to Harvard and had taken over as chair of the department here, I was delighted to discover that my colleagues all felt as warmly towards Beatrice as I did. In need of a Kant specialist at the time, we began a long but ultimately unsuccessful courtship, attempting to lure her here to Cambridge. I'm delighted to see her here again today. After yesterday's lecture, entitled I, Universal and Singular, we will hear today a lecture entitled I and Morality, Enlightenment and Suspicion. Please join me in welcoming Beatrice Longuenesse. Water.
Thank you. Does this work? Okay. Thank you very much, Sean, for this very generous introduction. Thank you all for coming a second time when the weather is finally nice and it's Friday. So I'm really, really happy you're here and happy I'm here again. Okay, so indeed today's topic is I and morality, enlightenment and suspicion. So in yesterday's lecture, I noted that in using I in I think this is a tree, I think this proof is valid, I think this is unfair, which are of course very different cases. We are circulating between, on the one hand, the radically individual standpoint on the world. We have, insofar as we are particular living beings with a body, a social situation, a culture, a particular biography, and so on, and the normatively universal standpoint we can claim to have as a rational living being. In those cases, the cases that I think, the universal standpoint we have and share, or should share, as rational human beings, can help us adjudicate the differences between our individual standpoints. The rational standpoint can help us locate those individual standpoints with respect to one another, and so arrive at a common conclusion about reality. My concern in today's lecture is not theoretical cognition, but practical cognition. Cognition of what we ought to do, and especially what we are morally obligated to do. Here the question on the table is, can we, not only in the case of theoretical cognition, but also in the case of practical cognition, and in particular cognition of right and wrong, rise above our particular standpoint? Do we find in the use of I in the moral I ought to the same kind of tension and collaboration we found in the case of I think between particular and universally shared standpoint? At the end of yesterday's lecture, taking my cue from Oliver Sacks's analysis of the case of Christina, the self-named, she's the one who named herself that way, the disembodied lady, I noted the proximity between Freud's notion of ego and its relation to consciousness of one's own body, on the one hand, and on the other, the two types of self-consciousness I argued were fundamental to our use of I, the consciousness of our being engaged in establishing rational unity among the contents of one's mental states, and the consciousness of our own body and its particular position in the world. In today's lecture, I will return to Freud's model of the mind and what we may learn from it. But this time I will argue that there are significant similarities between Freud's and Kant's respective views of the structure of mental life in morality. I will argue that those similarities help us get a better grip on the combination of particularity and universality in the type of self-consciousness involved in our moral claims. It is prima facie strange, actually stranger than in the case of ego and unity of our perception, certainly. And in fact, my interest in the relation between Kant and Freud started with ego and unity of our perception, and then I thought, but then what about morality? And so that's what got me thinking. And then I realized, no, there too, there were in fact interesting connections to make. So that's what I'm talking about now. But it is certainly stranger than in the case of ego and unity of our perception to suppose that comparing Kant's and Freud's view of the mind can possibly yield any useful result. So different are their approaches and concerns. Kant is interested in questions of justification. What kinds of justification can we offer for our claims to theoretical knowledge, and in particular these specific kinds of theoretical knowledge he thought were synthetic and a priori? What kinds of justification can we offer for our moral claims? In that context, Kant argued that a priori forms of theoretical cognition and a priori forms of moral reasoning are a necessary condition for any particular judgment about the world or about what we are morally obligated to do. Freud, in contrast, is a clinical psychologist, at least became eventually, after being a neurologist, became a clinical psychologist, interested in the origins of certain pathologies in our mental lives and the ways to relieve them. In that context, Freud came up with what he called his metapsychological views on the structure of mental life, and in particular, his views about the ways in which conflicting forces structuring the contents of our mental lives are often the sources of crippling pathological states, both mental and physical. How can such different approaches possibly illuminate each other or jointly contribute answers to the question I'm raising? It is important, of course, to keep in mind those differences between their respective concerns to properly assess the similarities and contrasts between Kant's and Freud's views. But I will argue that drawing on precisely those similarities and contrasts help us in framing answers to the question central to this second lecture. Can we rise in matters of morality above our particular standpoint, the standpoint rooted in our particular body, biography, culture, and society? Can we claim for our moral oughts the same kind of moral validity we claim, or at least sometimes claim, for our thoughts about the way things objectively are? It might be a weird thing to ask from someone who's sort of a Kantian, but I do have the question. To answer this question, I will proceed as follows. I will first examine Freud's conception of the structure of mental life and the place in that structure of the categorical imperative of morality. This will be part 2 of this presentation, 2 on the handout. In part 3, I will examine Kant's view of the same points, the structure of our mental life and the place within that structure of the categorical imperative of morality. In part 4, I will suggest some lessons from this confrontation, in particular with respect to the question that occupies me in these 2 talks, the tension between the radically individual nature of the first-person pronoun I and the claim to universal validity of at least some of the pronouncements we make in our own name or from what we call the first-person standpoint. In part 5, I will suggest some further directions for investigation. So first, Freud on the structure of mental life. In his 1923 essay, The Ego and the Id, Freud explains the distinction within the mind between different modes of functioning, different ways in which our representations are connected in our mental life. One mode of functioning is proper to what he calls the ego, the other is proper to what he calls the id, das Ich, das Es. Here's Freud on the ego, and that's T1, just after 221 on the handout. We have formed the idea, we, the clinical psychologists who work in my general sort of method, have formed the idea that in each individual there is a coherent organization of mental processes, or events, Vorgänge, and we call this his ego, so Ich. So that's not our first person pronoun. In that case, the substantivized Ich designates a particular kind of concatenation of mental contents, a particular way in which mental contents get concatenated. The coherent organization of mental processes is unified by the specific function it is called upon to perform. It is that aspect of the psyche that heeds the instructions of the external world and in which mental processes are organized in such a way that what the world is like finds representation in the mind. And of course, we're speaking here at the level of folk psychology, folk psychological states, phenomenally present states. It is driven by the effort to get things right about reality, namely by what Freud calls the reality principle. And in doing so, mental contents get organized according to elementary logical rules. That's what makes the ego so strikingly, at least similar to the unity of our perception that obeys logical rules in Kant. The id, das Es, in contrast, is the raw, emotional, more primitive, and by far most extended part of our mental life. It is the expression of our drives to obtain pleasurable states and to avoid unpleasant ones. It is governed not by the reality principle, but what Freud calls the pleasure-unpleasure principle, Lust-Unlust principle. The way representations are combined in the id is not driven by an effort to get things right about reality. Rather, it is driven by the effort to promote pleasurable representations and to avoid unpleasant ones, even at the cost of privileging fantasy over reality. And that's how das Es, the id, concatenates representations according to, as it were, rules or at least structures of its own, the so-called laws of primary processes, with its rules of condensation, displacement, and symbolization of contents. Of course, the reality principle and the pleasure-unpleasure, Lust-Unlust principle, are not unconnected. Indeed, the reality principle is fundamentally at the service of the pleasure-unpleasure principle. Consider this simple example. I'm thirsty, I need water, I find a tap, I make sure the water is drinkable, I fill up a pitcher, I fill a glass, I drink water. That's heeding the reality principle. I make use of elementary rules for assessing reality and its serviceable use, and proceed to quench my thirst. Here the reality principle is quite straightforwardly at the service of satisfying the pleasure principle. Being thirsty is needing to drink, obtaining a drink is obtaining pleasure, and avoiding the unpleasant situation of remaining thirsty. But most cases are more complicated, especially when it comes to our emotional life. I long for love, I find a loving partner whom I also love, I build a life with him or her. In this case too, I obtain pleasure from a real situation. But it's not easy, especially in matters of love, to find in the real world just the object that will satisfy our longing. Building a life with the object of our love takes work, and it takes the acceptance of some measure of disappointment. The ego, namely that structure of our mental life that heeds the reality principle, will tell us, get real. This is just how life is. Take your time, and also be ready for compromise. But the id, that structure of our life that heeds the pleasure principle, may drive us to retreat into fantasy, rather than dealing with the complications and frustrations of reality. If we heed the id and its pleasure principle, rather than the ego and its reality principle, we may even become incapable of distinguishing fantasy from reality. And this leads to serious forms of neurosis. Think, for instance, of the character of Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. She's a pretty young woman raised by loving parents in the quiet province of Normandy and living in the fantasy world of cheap 19th century novels. Then, as is the fate of the typical 19th century middle-class young woman in Normandy or anywhere else, she gets married to a quite ordinary man whom she loves, or thinks she loves, and who loves her, definitely. First, she fantasizes him as the Prince Charming of her dreams. Then reality sets in. No, he's not a Prince Charming. He is ordinary, painfully, ridiculously ordinary. So she starts projecting her fantasies in different directions. She keeps repeating, in more and more disastrous ways, her experiences of disappointment. She retreats into more and more irrational fantasies until the only option left to her is death, suicide by poison, the ultimate way in which she retreats from reality. She has long lost touch with the reality principle. Of course, in presenting the story in this way, I'm leaving out all sorts of aspects. First, the splendor of Flaubert's descriptions of countryside and people and city. And also, I'm leaving out the bitter social critique that is contained of bourgeois life in French province in the 19th century. But that's my point. What I'm focusing on here is Madame Bovary has really no outlet but adapting to this insufferable for a young woman of her kind situation. So she retreats into fantasy. And Flaubert said famously, Emma Bovary, c'est moi. Emma Bovary is I. Of course, he had the outlet of writing novels, which Emma Bovary didn't have. She was herself quite ordinary. Okay, so Flaubert's novel precedes Freud's essays in metapsychology by decades. Madame Bovary was published in 1857, The Ego and the Id in 1923. But as we know, novelists are the deepest investigators of the complicated twists of the human mind. I'm not doing justice here, as I just said, to the literary splendor of the novel, and I apologize to those of you who love that novel as I do. My main purpose here is to point out how eerily Emma Bovary fits Freud's description of the relation between ego and id within one and the same mind, or rather illustrates a failure of the ego to control the destructive fantasies of the id. And this is the text that's cited at T2. The ego is the part of the id, so the fundamental part, our mind is fundamentally id, emotional. The ego is the part of the id which is modified by the direct influence of the external world through the medium of the perception consciousness system. It also seeks to bring the influence of the external world, that will be important to my points to follow, the external world to bear on the id and its intentions. It strives to substitute the reality principle for the pleasure principle, which reigns without limits in the id, all the way to destruction. Now, if the distinction and potential conflict were just this, tension between ego and id, the resulting structure of mental life would already be complex enough. But there's one more complication. As Freud writes, and that's well known, that's T3 on the handout, if the ego were merely the part of the id modified by the influence of the perceptual system, the representative in the mind of the external world, that's the ego, we should have a simple state of things to deal with. But there is a further complication. We have been led to assume the existence of a stage in the ego, a differentiation within the ego, which may be called the ego ideal or superego. The fact that this part of the ego, fact that this part of the ego is less firmly connected with consciousness is the novelty which calls for explanation. This is in the context of a discussion of the distinction between conscious and unconscious, which is not going to occupy me here. I'm really interested in the different structures that are at play. If you want to discuss the unconscious in the Q&A, that's fine, but I'm not going to be discussing this here. So the full structural view is not just ego and id. It is ego, id, and superego. Freud's account is well known. The formation of the superego or ego ideal is contemporary with a dramatic phase in the development of the young child. The human infant learns to give up the idea that she is the exclusive love object of her parents or parental figures. She responds to the loss by internalizing the idealized figure of the beloved parent as well as the stern figure of the forbidding parent. Of course, each parent or parental figure plays both roles at different times, and in different ways. There is, in relation to each adult figure at the core of an infant's emotional life, an experience of love, loss, threat, resentment, and an effort to deal with all of that. It's hard to be a baby, as we all know, or don't know anymore, but can retrieve. Internalizing the parental figure is more than imitation. The latter, of course, is also a familiar phenomenon, where the baby and the young child mirror the mimics of the parents. But the internalization Freud is talking about is more radical than that. The scenario played out by the child is, you are me, I am you, so I cannot lose you. I'm afraid of you and angry at you, but if you're in me, you do not threaten me, nor are you threatened by me. It all happens within me. The whole drama is played within one and the same person, the baby, struggling to cope with love and loss. In the context of that story, generating the structure of the superego with at its center the forbidding figure of the fantasized, threatening parent, as well as the nurturing, forgiving figure of the loving parent, is the work of the id, das Es. It is an irrational, this is the explanation of why we can say it's the work of the Es, it is an irrational, emotional response to a radical experience of loss, solitude, and anxiety. Now, in the process of generating within the mental life of the child the figure of an ideal to look up to, the ego ideal, and a stern figure to obey, the superego, the emotional energy of the Es is also called upon to internalize with those figures the norms of speaking, thinking, and reasoning, and the norms of social life more generally, embodied by the figure or figures that occupy the parental role. This means that, on the one hand, the mental functioning Freud calls superego is emotional in its origin and its force within the mental life of the child. As such, it is a major source of fantasy rather than rational thinking, and spins fantasies, which we find again in dreams, and we all know those phenomena now, they're quite familiar today. As such, it is a major source of fantasy rather than rational thinking. But on the other hand, its contents are more and more rational in form. The tools of language are also tools for conceptualizing, judging, and reasoning. These contents thus eventually become tools for assessing the very norms born from its emotional origin that the superego carries with it. This is a very important mechanism, and I will have to return to it when I get to the comparison with Kant and Freud. Freud describes as the liquidation of the Oedipus complex the phase in the mental life of the child that consists in accepting separation and internalizing the parental law. When explaining that phase, Freud offers these striking statements about its ramifications into the moral attitudes of the adult human being. And that's T4 on your handout. I think it's on page 2 of the handout. As the child was once under a compulsion to obey its parents, so the ego submits to the categorical imperative of the superego. And in another text of the same period, in case one doubted that, it's Kant's categorical imperative he's talking about, Freud is explicit about the Kantian ancestry of the expression categorical imperative that appears in the passage just cited. That's T5 on the handout. Kant's categorical imperative is the direct heir of the Oedipus complex. This is a surprising statement. Kant's intention was to ground the categorical imperative of morality on reason alone. Freud, in contrast, maintains that the categorical imperative is the direct heir of the Oedipus complex. It is the direct heir of the situation in which the infant, when confronted with an experience of loss and with the stern command to accept the loss, internalized the parental law, or what's perceived as an imperative, the law as an imperative, in a desperate attempt to respond to that experience of loss. How are the two views comparable at all, let alone compatible? Why would Freud pick out, of all people, the Kantian categorical imperative as especially related to the Oedipus complex? what could Freud's genealogy of morality possibly have in common with Kant's investigation of the form and justification of moral commands? Yet I now want to suggest that Freud's genealogy of the moral imperatives is at least compatible, and I think actually more than compatible, at least compatible, with Kant's investigation of that justificatory structure. I want to suggest more generally that Freud's genealogy of both ego and superego contributes to our understanding of the combination of particular and universal claims carried by our use of I in the moral I ought to. So to show this, I will now explore Kant's view of the structures of our mental life and what the Freudian account I just sketched owes to Kant's view. So I'm aware that I'm speaking here in the company of very, very distinguished Kantians. So prima inter pares being right here under my nose. So a lot of what I'm going to say is very familiar to you, and I apologize for that, but I thought it was nevertheless useful to make clear, so what it is I'm focusing on, which are the crucial points on which then my argument about why the comparison is useful, and that I'm standing ready to be corrected at any point in the course of the discussion. Okay, so that's 2-3, Kant on the categorical imperative of morality. The categorical imperative of morality, first I should say, which is again a point extremely well known here but worth starting from, is not the only kind of imperative. Before considering it, I need to say something about other kinds of imperative. Generally, what justifies a course of action is the goal or goals we set ourselves. If I want to be a good musician, then I ought to practice my scales every day. If I want to be in good shape for my exam, I ought to go to bed early. If I want to be in good terms with my neighbor, I ought to be civil to her, and so on. I ought to practice my scales, I ought to go to bed early, I ought to be civil to my neighbor, are prescriptions we impose on ourselves. Kant calls these self-prescribed oughts imperatives, marching orders we give ourselves. Whether we formulate them explicitly or not, and mostly we don't formulate explicitly, we constantly act on such imperatives. And this is because we are constantly adjudicating different possible actions and choosing one against others we might perhaps be more immediately inclined to undertake. The examples of imperatives I just gave are called by Kant hypothetical because they take the implicit hypothetical form I was just citing, where the antecedent is the statement of a goal. So it's not just that they have that form, but the content of the antecedent is always a goal premised on my inclination. They are imperatives we give ourselves on the condition or hypothesis that there is something we want to achieve. The particular goal of becoming a good musician, the particular goal of succeeding in my exam, the particular goal of being in good terms with my neighbor. Moral imperatives are not like that. They're not like that for Kant, and arguably in this he agrees with a fairly common view of morality. Moral imperatives are unconditional. What I ought to do is just what I ought to do because it's the right thing to do, period. This is what Kant means when he calls them categorical. They take the form of categorical judgments. I ought to X. Not hypothetical judgments of the form, if I want Y, antecedent stating a particular goal, then I ought to X. The morally commendable thought is not, if I want to be in good terms with my neighbor, I ought to be kind to her. The morally commendable thought is, I ought to be kind to my neighbor just because it is the right thing to do. But then, what is it that makes a choice of action or of attitude the right choice, period? Without any previous end determining the fact that it is the right choice. Kant's answer is to come up with a principle that is supposed to provide a universal criterion for what makes an action the right thing to do. There are many formulations of this principle, each elaborately commented on by Kant, and then the object of an industry of academic commentary to this day. I'm going to give you only the first one of them. Discussing Kant's moral theory would, of course, call for discussing all of them, but that's not my goal. My goal is to get a grip on the question I'm asking at the beginning, the relation between the particular and the universal. and of course to clarify the relation between Kant's and Freud's view of a categorical imperative. So here's the first formulation of the categorical imperative given in part 1 of groundwork. I ought, that's T6 on the handout, I ought never to act except in such a way that I could also will that my maxim should be a universal law. In this first formulation, the categorical imperative is expressed in the first person. In the second part of groundwork, Kant offers a second formulation, which is in fact an alternative formulation of that very first one, this time in the second person imperative. Act only in accordance with that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. This makes explicit what was already implicit in the first person formulation of the imperative in thinking I ought to X, morally ought to X. I am both the author, or I ought generally actually, I'm both the author and the recipient of the unconditionally binding moral imperative. But why should I assign myself such an imperative? Why should we test our maxims in light of such an extremely demanding principle? Kant's answer is, we just do. We find the imperative in us. We don't always pay attention to it. It's not that every time we engage in a particular action, we ask ourselves, wait a minute, could I will that everyone should act in accordance with the maxim in accordance with which I am myself about to act? By the way, there's a point I didn't talk about, which is that the maxim which you can at the same time will, there's of course a question of, so what is the criterion of impossibility here? And it's a very strong criterion of logical impossibility, or what Kant calls in his metaphysical text, real impossibility. Whether logical impossibility is a conceptual impossibility, what he calls contradiction in conception. If you universalize your maxim, then the very concept of the action would become self-contradictory. Or real impossibility, namely, if you universalize your maxim, there is no possible cause for such an action, because it would be in contradiction with the fundamental nature of a human will. So it's not just, is it pragmatically possible? Or it's really a very strong notion of possibility or impossibility that is related to Kant's broader metaphysical views. But okay, that's just, and that it's important to keep in mind, also to keep in mind what will follow. Okay, so what should we assign ourselves such an imperative? We just do, we find it in ourselves in virtue of what we are. And it's not that every time we engage in a particular action, we ask ourselves, wait a minute, could I will that everyone should act in accordance with the maxim I'm about to act in accordance with? Rather, Kant's claim, as I understand it, is that as a matter of fact, an action whose implicit or explicit maxim, which I already have in virtue of the catalogue of hypothetical imperatives under which I act, I have all sorts of goals to fulfill. So I have all sorts of maxims that will help me fulfill those goals, but an action whose explicit or implicit maxim violates the principle just stated will raise a red flag in our mind. We will feel something's wrong. We may still do the wrong thing, and even when we do what is in fact the right thing to do, we may do it for non-moral, self-interested reasons. Sometimes heeding our own interest just happens to converge with what morality would command, and that's okay. As long as it is also the case that even if it were not in our own interest, we would let the principle do its discriminating job. In any particular case, the principle either allows us to go on our merry way without pangs of conscience and to act in accordance with the maxim that suits our goal, or on the contrary, the principle leads us to stop on our tracks, think twice, and perhaps decide against the maxim in accordance with which we were about to act. Note that this has some similarity with what I was describing yesterday in the case of a proof. This proof is valid? Wait a minute. Yes, I think this proof is valid. I'm about to act on this maxim, and I stop on my track. Wait a minute. No, I ought not to do that. There's some similarity, although of course the way it functions is quite different, because in one case it's knowing or thinking, in the other case it's willing. Can I really will that? No, I cannot. Now, if it is true that we in fact have which was my first answer. We just do. We have that principle in us as an implicit, discriminating principle in us, for which we need no further reason. We still want an answer to the question, why do we have it? So another type of reason, not what is the antecedent in virtue of which we act on that principle, but why does it exist in the first place? Why is it in us in the first place? What is it about us that makes it the case that we have it, that we have in us such a principle? Kant's answer is, as rational beings, we are capable of a universal standpoint from which to determine our own will, namely, a standpoint universally shared by human beings as rational beings, from which to assess the particular reasons we may have to act one way rather than another on hypothetical imperatives. Just as we are capable of a universal standpoint in cognition, so we are capable of a universal standpoint in willing, a standpoint for which we claim normative validity for all human beings, as human beings, namely animal and rational. Having such a standpoint in us as an essential property of our will makes us autonomous, self-legislating. This is because in adopting it, we are not tossed around by our particular inclinations of the moment, nor are we simply exercising our reason to adjudicate the best way to make our individual maxims, which depend on our natural inclinations, mutually consistent and thus long-lasting. The categorical imperative is an imperative to act in accordance with maxims that are normatively assessed from the standpoint of humanity as such and as rules by which we act on the world as a whole. So again, an I that's radically individual and universal, that holds within itself the standpoint of humanity as such. The imperative not to adopt rules I could not also will to be adopted, according to the could not, that's very strong, I was just pointing to be adopted by the totality of other human beings, is not prescribed to us by our own existence as particular living beings having natural inclinations and needs in any given situation, nor is it prescribed by an authority external to our own reason. It is dictated by reason itself as a practical capacity to be autonomous, self-legislating. Now, this cannot possibly be what Freud had in mind when he said that the categorical imperative was a direct heir of the Oedipus complex. As we saw, for Freud, the ground level of the moral attitude is emotional. It is based not in the ego, but in the id and its outgrowth, the superego. The moral attitude is not a feature of my mental life I find in me, as I find it in me in Kant and also in Freud. But for Freud, it's not a feature of my mental life I find in me, insofar as I am a rational being that examines and endorses, or, as the case may be, rejects maxims that will guide my actions. Rather, it is a feature of my mental life imposed on me by the most archaic stage of my maturing from infancy to childhood, and by the residues of that stage into adulthood. How can this possibly have anything to do with Kant's equating morality with self-legislation, autonomy? But actually, Freud's genealogy of morality gives our moral attitudes an ambiguous status. The origin of morality is in the id and its outgrowth, the superego, and that's what gives it its categorical nature. We thought we are born into a structure of normativity, which is the parental structure, the triangular structure of the child and her parents, or whatever structure of adult supervision and care and love and distance she is born into. So the origin of morality, with its categorical nature, not premised on any particular end that the child would satisfy, is in the id and its outgrowth, the superego. But the energy of the id, giving rise to the superego and ego ideal, is thereby enrolled into the task of internalizing to the mental life of the young child the features of the ego, the learning of logically consistent rules, including the rules for giving and assessing reasons in general. To that extent, claiming that the categorical imperative or Kant's categorical imperative is the direct heir of the Oedipus complex is saying, on the one hand, that the root of its categorical nature is emotional, and on the other hand, that the emotional life that sustains the unconditional command and the unconditional nature of morality also sustains the development of the ability to assess, endorse, or reject justifications, including justification for the categorical nature of moral commands. So I now want to develop this point in some detail, and that's to 4 lessons from Freud, Enlightenment, and Suspicion. And the reason I adopted the term suspicion is that, as you no doubt know, there was this mantra in late 20th century European philosophy, at least, that there was those 3 masters of suspicion, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. And the suspicion was directed at any claim to the universal validity of norms, and in particular, moral norms. And the claim to universality was always hiding something. Class interest for Marx, will to power for Nietzsche, and repression of sexuality for Freud. And so that's why I've taken up the term, but I don't think Freud is actually a master of suspicion, but that's how he's classified, and that's why there's a problem to address. Okay. So what lessons from Freud, given what I'm suggesting about how we should understand the statement about the categorical imperative is the direct heir of the Oedipus complex? I should first note that it's not just, or even first, the Kantian categorical imperative of morality that Freud sees as originating in the internalization by the child of the lost parental figure. It is also the whole set of religious and social norms. This is T8 on the handout, just below 2.4. Religion, morality, and a social sense, the chief elements in the higher side of man, and I don't think he says that ironically, were originally one and the same thing. Now, such a view certainly is the opposite of Kant's. Kant's view was that the principle of morality is independent of any particular religious or social belief or norm. This is why he gave it the absolutely universal form discussed in the previous part of this presentation. He offered a formula for what is categorical about morality that did not ground morality in a particular religion or in a particular social order, but presented this as binding for humankind as such. Now, a familiar worry is that the very idea of a universal foundation for morality is itself relative to a particular society and to a particular stage in the history of humankind. The idea of universal law and of subordinating the goals of one's individual will to those of a universal will are ideas born from the 18th century Enlightenment. Therefore, the first part of my title, Enlightenment. Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative, so the objection goes, I think it was first formulated and really developed in a systematic sense by Cassirer. Oh no, that's me. Okay. Sorry. That's somebody protesting what I'm saying. No, it says scam likely, so I'm reassured. Okay, I'm sorry. Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative, so the objection goes, is inspired by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of course. And there's a paper by Cassirer called Kant and Rousseau, and his political model of the social contract, in which each individual gives up her individual will to become a participant in the constitution of a universal will, and thereby becomes freer than he was before, as Rousseau says. Devient plus libre qu'auparavant. That's a Republican ideal that inspired the French Revolution. So one might say, in his first formulation of the categorical imperative, both in its first person and imperative form, Kant internalizes to the moral imperatives, supposed to be to the moral imperative in the singular, supposed to be an atemporal structure of the human will, insofar as it's rational, an idea of universal law that originates in the political ideal of the social contract. That is the Rousseauian version. Now we can readily acknowledge the importance of the historical context in determining the contents of moral imperatives, including the purely formal, universalist content of Kant's formulation of the categorical imperative, or of the principle of all categorical imperatives. But the historical dependence of Kant's categorical imperative does not constitute by itself a debunking objection against Kant's view of morality. Genealogy does not necessarily debunk justification. On Freud's account, it is the proper work of the ego to transform our unruly emotional attitudes, the moral attitude more than any other, into reasoned attitudes. Viewed in this light, Kant's attempt to offer a rational formulation of the categorical imperative of morality certainly counts as an exemplary effort. That effort results, moreover, and both depends on and results in expanding the scope of our moral concerns beyond their original boundaries, from the original parental structure that became historically broadened to local communities, tribes, civil society, church, body politic, to humanity as such. And so, even if we suppose that indeed, and I think that's right, that Kant is inspired by the Rousseauian model of the social contract, well, he's just part of using that model is just part of the effort at finding a rational formulation of what might be categorical about morality, which is itself, of course, informed by this new view of human beings. Whatever is categorical has to hold for all human beings and not either your internal family structure or your broader, the broadening scope of the moral concern. When recapitulating in Chapter 7 of Civilization and its Discontent, the origin and developmental stages of human beings' moral attitudes, Freud explicitly mentions the broadening of the scope of moral concerns to humanity as a whole. But he does not take this broadening to be an unmitigated progress. With the expansion of moral concern, says Freud, comes the expansion of the sense of guilt, and with it, the backlash of aggression directed at one's own internalized accuser or at a fantasized external accuser, the individuals or groups perceived as threatening and accusatory. And this is T9 on your handout, page 3, I just have a 244. If civilization is a necessary course of development from the family to humanity as a whole, then as a result of the inborn conflict arising from ambivalence, of the eternal struggle between the trends of love and death, there is inextricably bound up with it an increase of the sense of guilt, which will perhaps reach heights that the individual finds hard to tolerate. And of course that was written in 1930, so that was a rough time, especially for someone who was a Jew in Vienna. If Freud is right, what is the answer to the question with which I started this second presentation? The question, remember, was the following: is our use of I in the moral I ought to premise, just as our use of I in I think, on the type of self-consciousness that has both a radically individual and a universal aspect? If so, what exactly is in this case the relation between the radically individual referent of I refers to whoever thinks the proposition which I is in use, and the claim to universal validity of at least some of the claims made in the first person on the general model, I morally ought to X, or I'm morally obligated to X. For reasons of space and time, I can only outline a very general suggestion here. The suggestion builds both on what we learn from Freud's therapeutic method and on the role of civilization in the development of the human capacity of rationality. So that's my point 2.5, I and morality. First, the lessons from therapy, and you'll see why the lessons from therapy might be ridiculous to start. We don't need therapy to be moral, but in some ways we do. So that's it's an everyday process, as it were. In his 1914 essay, Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through, Freud explains that a central feature of neurosis is repetition. The early traumatic experience of love and loss keeps being repeated and replayed in various contexts, dreams, current relationships, work situations, and the patient's relationship to the analyst in the talk therapy. In the context of the therapy, however, repetition becomes a tool for the cure itself. Insofar as the patient keeps repeating the past situation in the relatively safe, cordoned-off context of the analyst's office, she is in a position to observe it and to confront the fantasies repeatedly spun by the id with the reality she's now in a position to assess as an adult and a rational adult. Her relationship to the analyst, not only as a fantasized object of the repeated traumatic situation, that's the residues of the childhood self coming to the surface, but also as the ordinary human being she is facing in the context of the analytic cure and the fairly ugly office she is sitting in. The reality principle, says Freud, is thus given the opportunity in this safe context gradually to take precedence over the pleasure and unpleasure principle. But this means that the proper context in which the adult ego can gradually take over the mental scene is that in which the perception of external reality imposes its relentless standard of correctness on the fantasies of the id and the ego ideal. This is what Freud summarized in that striking sentence I've been citing a lot, wo es war, da soll ich werden, which you can both translate as where it was, there must I come to be, or where the structure id was, there must the structure ego, which allows me to think and will in the first person come to be. The ego is that structure of mental life governed by the reality principle, which, as I have argued both in the first lecture and in the second, is a psychological counterpart to what Kant calls the objective unity of our perception. This means that it is not by observing oneself and reflecting on one's attitudes that one comes to give prevalence to the ego over the id. In fact, there are some pretty harsh, scathing criticism of obsession with oneself in Kant's Critique of Practical Reason. Rather, it is, as Freud says, by widening the field of the ego's perception, substituting in one's relation to the world a mental structure in which emotion is checked by perception and rationality, to one in which perception and rationality are caught in the whirlpool of emotion. I say the whirlpool of emotion because the expression comes up in a text I'm going to cite later, which I love the expression. The understanding of Freud's characterization of the analytic cure I'm too quickly sketching here is, I believe, in broad agreement with the one Richard Moran offers in chapters 3 and 4 of Authority and Estrangement. There may be a slight difference in emphasis, and we'll find that out maybe in the Q&A. Moran rightly insists on the fact that for Freud, overcoming neurotic symptoms will not be obtained by the patients relying on the third-person standpoint the therapist can offer on her neurotic symptoms, which you see on TV shows, the cheap representations of analytic therapy on TV. Oh, you're hating your mother here. No, that won't work. Rather, therapeutic success depends on the patient gaining first-person knowledge by avowal of her own feelings and emotions. For the analysis to do its work, the feelings and emotions whose scene is being repeated in the neurosis and then in the context of the analytic treatment must be avowed, acknowledged from a first-person point of view, as opposed to being the object of a third-person detached knowledge, that of the analyst or even that of the patient herself, who becomes very adept at observing her own behavior. Then, that's bizarre. But it's much more difficult to let the surge of the emotion come up and then avow it. I hate her. Yes, I hate her, and so on. But avowing, in turn, is bringing the emotion into the purview of consciousness as the emotion it is, and thus making it liable to be observed by the patient herself and assessed in light of her newly developed view of reality. Moran says as much, I believe, when he writes, and maybe that's not exactly what you meant, the rationality of the patient's response to her sense of betrayal by a particular person requires that she be in a position to avow her attitude toward him and not just describe or report on it, however accurately. For it is only from the position of avowal that she is necessarily acknowledging facts about him as internally relevant to that attitude, say as justifying it or undermining it, and thereby also as relevant to the fully empirical question of whether it remains true that she indeed has this sense of being betrayed by him. And so in my understanding of Freud's view is, and whether it remains true, the change occurs in light of, so I'm now an adult saying this, so acknowledging, but then able to assess it in light of the reality of not me, but the person I have in front of me. In light of my sense of reality, doesn't the emotion dissipate or something like that? That's how I understand the point, and that's why I'm not exactly sure. That's how Dick understands it. So. Now, why is it important that that's how I understand the point? Because I think what I want to emphasize is that there are two uses of the first person in the situation described. One is the first person avowal of feeling and emotion, the expression of an individually lived experience. I fear this person, or I hate this person, with the subtext, she has been betraying me all my life. The other, where she has been betraying me all my life, is governed by, I hate her. And maybe the conclusion worked the wrong way, if you like. The latter, the second use of I, is the first person expression of thinking, I don't think this person actually betrayed me. So this second one is the expression of the ego's effort at acquiring an objective standpoint on the world. And that's what I meant by substituting for the id governed by the whirlpool of emotion being itself what governs the thought of the ego, the reverse direction, the thoughts of the ego, gradually making irrelevant at least some of the whirlpool of emotions in which I was wallowing. So the former is the expression of my individual feeling. That feeling, if built on unconscious neurotic fantasy, may be vanquished not in light of introspective examination, oh, do I feel that way? But in light of the recovered relation to the existing, current world of objects, including objects to which my emotions connect. So that's all I will say about therapy. What does any of this have to do with morality? The moral stance consists in the disposition to override personal interest in favor of the categorical commands of moral obligation, premised on that categorical form of the moral imperative. Surely it is not a matter of therapy. Surely acquiring a moral stance one rationally endorses cannot be reduced to substituting for the fantasized representation of reality born from the id and an overbearing superego, the objective representation of reality by the ego and the resulting weakening of emotional storms. And that's true, it cannot be so reduced. Yet, if we accept Freud's remarks concerning the enlargement of moral concerns from family to humanity as a whole, and the dangers of the related expansion of guilt and aggressive reactions, then morality does have something to do with the kind of therapy Freud describes. In all human societies, the human infant's development includes the internalization of norms that trump any particular self-interested rules for prudential and instrumental agency. Those are the categorical norms of morality. The capacity of the adult human being to integrate those norms into her rational view of the world she inhabits depends on three central factors. The first factor, and that's what has to do with what I was saying about the therapeutic situation in which we are in our everyday life. The first factor is the more or less terrifying ways in which the original norms have been internalized into the infant's mental life. The less terrifying the original internalization of the categorical nature of moral commands, the more open is the mind to the individual, the mind of the individual, to assess, adopt, or reject any particular historical iteration or revision of the categorical norms. That's the first factor. You need to have a free mind, as it were, to be able to accede to the expanded moral standpoint that is demanded of us today in some ways. The second, that was demanded in the 18th century, and that's even more, in fact, an even more expanded standpoint is demanded today. But that I won't say anything about, but we can also discuss in the Q&A. The second factor is the greater or lesser degree to which her current social context allows the expansion of her moral compass. The more open the society, the more space is left for such expansion. That's a point that has been very well developed by my colleague Sam Scheffler in his book on human morality. The third factor is the way in which her ego, with its reality principle, and I think that's a factor that is not sufficiently paid attention to. The third factor is the way in which her ego, with its reality principle, that is to say, her perception of the external world and the richness of her perception of the external world, nurtures the expansion of her moral compass. The greater scope is allowed to our perception of the world, and I mean perception in the broad sense, not just immediate perceptual experience, but what it is we take in about what the world is like, what exactly is the nature of the world we inhabit. The greater scope is allowed to our perception of the world in which we live, the broader the potential scope of our moral compass. None of those three factors can do its work on its own. Each relies on the other two to obtain the expansion of our moral compass. I submit it is this kind of expansion, guided by the work of the ego and its reality principle, that Freud had in mind when he wrote, and that the passage in which the famous sentence where it was that the ego must come to be fits. That's T11 on the handout. The intention of psychoanalysis is to strengthen the ego, to make it more independent of the superego, to widen its field of perception. And I understand again, perception for Freud is always, perception is for the ego what the drives are for the id. So it's always outward directed. Expand its field of perception and enlarge its organization, I mean the organization of the ego, so that it can appropriate fresh portions of the id. And that's where the substituting for the world of emotions, the reality principle. Where id was, there must ego come to be, wo es war, da soll ich werden. It is a work of culture, not unlike the draining of the Zuiderzee. The Zuiderzee was that marsh in the Netherlands that was drained with a huge dam. That's the dam against the sea, which is the id. So it's a hard work. Note that it is the field of perception, as I've been insisting, which the development of the ego allows us to broaden, thereby also broadening our moral compass. Perception is not self-examination. It is directed not at ourselves, but at the world, including, as I have argued in the first lecture, our particular place in the world. It is from that directedness at the world that we can hope to achieve the expansion of our moral concerns and the reduction of their aggressive counterparts. Freud's serene tone, or what I really receive as a serene tone in the text I just cited, it's funny because it comes 2 years after the Civilization and its Discontent. It's much more serene in tone. It's the general introduction it's the new introduction to psychoanalytic lectures. I don't know, it's beautifully serene in comparison to the other one. But in the text I cited from Civilization and its Discontent, which was T9, which is the one where he says, with the expansion of our moral compass, we also have expansion of aggression and ambivalence. And it's immediately followed by this, which is much more in tune with the text from the new introductory lectures. If civilization is, no, I'm not going to reread the first part, I'm just going to read the part that is the encouraging one. So the first part was the one that said, with the expansion to humanity as a whole, there is inextricably bound up an increase of sense of guilt and therefore aggression. But then he goes on, and we may well heave a sigh of relief at the thought that it is nevertheless vouchsafed to a few to salvage without effort from the whirlpool, that's where the whirlpool comes in, from the whirlpool of their own feelings, the deepest truths, towards which the rest of us, including Freud, have to find our way through tormenting uncertainty and with restless groping. So the question is, what exactly did he mean? I will first conclude and then make some additional note that just came. I was wondering about this a minute ago, and I will say something about what exactly did he mean, which I hadn't wondered about, or at least in that way before. Anyway, what was my conclusion initially? What we find in the moral I ought to, if we go on by both what I said about Kant, what I said about Freud, and my claim about, it does clarify something about how we should think about the categorical imperative. what we find in the moral I ought to is the combination of our particular standpoint, premised on our individual emotional biography on the one hand, and the moral I ought to as understood by Kant, with this extended moral compass to humanity as such, and a standpoint that makes a claim to be rationally endorsed and binding for all on the other. But if we take the Freudian lesson seriously, the connection between the two is more tormented in the case of the I of the moral I ought to than we found it in the case of the I of I think. For the categorical obligations of morality are not only pitted against individual interests, which makes it already more difficult. You know, the revolution in standpoint of the Copernican revolution, it's a fantastic achievement, but there's no particular interest in remaining in the particular standpoint once you've realized that the other one actually gives you a better grip on reality. Whereas in the case of the moral standpoint, even without talking about my story about Freud, it's much more difficult to give up particular interest, your particular standpoint on what you ought to do in virtue of your hypothetical antecedents, and do this revolution of adopting the standpoint on the whole. So there's already this difficulty. The first reason for which adopting a universal standpoint is much more difficult. But moreover, even its categorical nature, which is what the universal standpoint is premised on, as developed by Kant, is rooted in our individual history of love, loss, and reactive aggression, if Freud is right. And the modern claims to the universality of moral concerns can easily fall prey to social, political, or cultural prejudice and to a narrow perception of the world. This is why the deepest truths, which the blessed few can salvage without effort from the whirlpool of their own feelings, are for the rest of us to be reached only through tormenting uncertainty and with restless groping. And so what I started thinking about, just as I was reading these notes, so who are those happy few? Who did Freud had in mind? And then I couldn't help thinking, especially given Freud's own back, he had to have in mind someone like Spinoza. And if that's true, the deepest truth, well, precisely the point is, they cease in some sense to be moral truths. They're more, and that fits their ethical truth, the ethics. And that fits well with my point that the three ways in which your moral compass expands are personal therapy, being carried along by a society that allows you to, that nurtures in you that expanded moral compass, and understanding the world. And I think that was exactly Spinoza's point, actually, and I think that's the lesson from Freud. Now, what's interesting, too, and I don't want to go too long, but I'll just throw those quick thoughts on how I would like to go on, is that also takes us, of course, close to Hegel, who compared to Kant is a return to Spinoza in some sense, with an emphasis on the first person. And Hegel had the sort of peeve against Kant's categorical imperative that it was actually modeled on a contractarian model, which is a juridical model and has nothing to do with the question, nothing, is a phase we have to go through but should overcome to get to a better sort of grip on what it is on which the thought, and a thought we can share with all, of not only how we ought to live, but how we ought to act, should be premised. So I think that in some sense it would be closer to Spinoza than to Hegel, because Freud, like Spinoza, has no illusion about the possibility of how far we can go in overcoming our personal, emotional turmoils or whirlpool of emotions. And also, he's a naturalist. And Freud's lesson, even if it integrates the Kantian lesson, of course, we can understand why the form of the imperative of morality in its categorical nature would have, at some point, reached that formulation. But ultimately, it's grounded in nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. We'll take a short break, 5 minutes, and we'll reconvene for questions. Okay. Okay, so the first question goes to Chris.
Beatrice, this is mostly a clarification question, because I am just a little unclear at what you're proposing exactly about the relation between Kant and Freud. Early on in the paper, you said the views were at least compatible. But towards the end, it sounded like you were saying something much stronger. But I wasn't sure exactly what it was.
Yeah.
I mean, you could think something as strong as, in forcing us to attend to reality, the ego is what makes us rational.
Yeah.
Or you could think of it as something like, well, being rational is independent of all that, but we wouldn't be capable of being governed by reason if we hadn't gone through this Freudian process. So, I mean, is something in there in what you're saying?
So I'm afraid I have to confess first, but then I will try to answer nevertheless, that I'm not sure I have settled about at least compatible or compatible. Because I had written in the text I was sort of presenting from, I'd written compatible, and then in reading it said at least compatible. Why? Why do I sort of have a sort of modally weak, I think, here? Because I think there is, so how could I say that? When I say compatible in a sort of affirmative way, what I mean is that Freud definitely is not out to debunk Kant's categorical imperative in those statements, as he has mostly been taken to do. That when Freud says Kant's categorical imperative is a direct heir of the Oedipus complex, what he's taken to mean is, forget about Kant's claim to rationality, this is all about the story of repression and an overbearing superego. And there's a whole Lacanian school in France of presenting itself as Lacanian. I don't know exactly what Lacan is. It's all about the law, and the law is about the superego, and it's about the infant learning to deal with it. And I think that's not it. I think Freud takes Kant's categorical imperative very seriously, but he says now be careful about its origin, and once you have in view its origin, you also realize that it is constantly at work against something that is more dangerous to it than simply the fact that it has to fight individual inclination or individual interest or etc. There's something more fundamental, which is that very force that allowed it to arise, that allowed what to arise? That allowed the sense of categorical command that is that trumps any particular imperative I might formulate. And the categorical command, what's interesting is it's premised on love, but it's also premised on loss. That's the structure of categoricity. And then you learn to expand it. And the fact that it is expanded to the whole of humanity, Freud does take to be an incredible progress of civilization. But he also, and I think he has in mind there, the whole story of Enlightenment. But don't be under illusion, with it comes also an expansion of the possible outbursts of aggression and resentment, and I'm sure he had in mind the developments in Germany at the time, and I think we can find sort of echoes in today's situation, that the very fact that we have expanded, or an expanded circle of beings that have a claim on us, and that we have to acknowledge have a claim on us, has maybe not always in the same people, but sometimes in the same people, as its backlash. Also, the development of resentment, aggression, fantasized accuser, and so on. So why at least compatible? Maybe why do I nevertheless, I'm also tempted to weaken the claim and say, well, at least compatible. Because so that's the way it is compatible, and even it gives a very interesting story of why the Kantian imperative is so, why it has such a strong claim. such a strong claim to be, yes, indeed, the structure of the moral command. But at least compatible, because I think much more, and that's what I was saying at the beginning, much more than in the case of the ego and the unity of perception, there's a revision of the Kantian view of morality in Freud. He is revisionist, namely, or if we say, yes, Freud has to contribute to our understanding of the categorical imperative, then he also contributes to our revision. Not only because it is meaningful to say, yes, it's in us, but it's in us because of this story of drive, rather than because of we are, as a matter of our nature, purely rational. There's, our true self is the purely rational. That's not a minor revision, but also because if we understand it in this history, both essentialist, there's something essentially proper to us in this idea of a categorical structure that trumps any particular inclination. It's also a historicization. And so, contrary to what Kant thought, this is not the final say on what the formula, if there is any, of morality is. So, for instance, whether it should be formulated in terms of law, I don't know. I think it says something because it allows the formulation of universality. Whether in the second formulation it should be formulated as humanity as an end in itself, I'm not sure. But in any case, what's absolutely certain is that the Freudian outlook, with the historicized view I am suggesting, and with those three components in the expansion of our moral compass, means that there is something about Kant's view of morality that definitely, for instance, there's a not universally shared, but certainly strongly shared or shared by a strong circle view that the contractarian model is not sufficient. You can have a direct claim on our moral concern without being yourself a moral subject. Animals, the question you've talked a lot about. So there's a lot to think about. So if we want to hold today the universalist claim of the Kantian view, formulation of morality, how should it be formulated? And in any case, it certainly cannot be, and is not by Freud in that sense, it's incompatible with Kant's view, premised on this metaphysical duality of the noumenal and the phenomenal. So that's the at least. And the compatible is, there's no debunking in Freud's story. That's what I mean.
If I can just have one follow-up. There's something about the Freud story that you're not emphasizing that I would have expected you to emphasize, which is it's not just that there are outbreaks of resentment and aggression. This is something the Freud story and the Nietzsche story have in common. The aggression is directed against the self.
Yeah.
And that's what guilt is aggression directed against the self. And if you're talking about, if you're trying to tell a story about how we become capable of governing ourselves in accordance with reason, that would seem to play a possible role. That it's by directing aggression against ourselves that we become to self-governing creatures.
So
we punish ourselves for doing the wrong thing, and that makes us self-governing.
So I'm not sure what you mean by bringing this up. So let me say what I would respond, and maybe it will not address what you mean, what you have in mind, and then you will tell me. Addressing what Freud says about resentment and aggression, and the fact that, yes, the development of morality is inseparable with the development of resentment and aggression against oneself, that's precisely what I was thinking I was addressing, but I was probably not explicit or clear enough in talking about the therapy. And that's exactly what morality should be, as much as possible, dissociated from. And so I suppose really what you mean is, and Freud would be critical of Kant for not dissociating it enough. Is that what you mean?
Well, certainly the sense that Nietzsche certainly has, maybe Freud does too, that we're going to go beyond this stage, partly has to do with the idea that we're at the stage we're at now, we're too aggressive with ourselves. We're hurting ourselves too much.
Yes, but that's why I was suggesting at the end that who he had in mind with the people who are in touch with the deepest truth would be Spinoza, and that's not Nietzsche. So that preserved the universalist sort of component of Kant's view, but with the Rousseauian idea of the revolution from individual will to integrated into the universal will, with the Spinozist consciousness of the danger of that very move, and the Hegelian consciousness of the danger of that very move. So, yes, certainly going beyond, but the going beyond, in my view, I don't think at all of Freud as a Nietzschean. I think it's a complete mistake to pair Freud with Nietzsche. And he does say that he owes the term id to Nietzsche, but he wants to promote the ego. And the ego is not a superman, or it's not someone who's done with all those demands of morality. It's someone who's learned to, as I understand, and Freud is not optimistic about that. But that's the goal. He's not optimistic about that. But going beyond resentment and aggression is learning to express it. And once having expressed it, making it part of the world against which it has to be assessed, and thus getting rid of it. Now, what Spinoza said was, you don't vanquish a passion except by an opposite passion, not by reason. So what would be the passion for Freud? Well, that's where the expanded moral compass comes in. The expanded moral compass is having an emotion, not just a rational, but an emotional connection to the world in which you live. But even that emotional connection of a different kind from that turmoil of emotions of the infant, is itself fed by knowledge, understanding. And that's Spinoza's love of God, the wise man is in the love. So it's that whole story. So in that sense, yes, there is a going beyond Kant's view of morality for Freud, namely the conflict. It's only an ideal. Freud thinks we will never reach that point. In that sense, he's not a Hegelian. There's no reconciliation. Our story is too deeply rooted in the infant helplessness. And this original story, no history of humankind will ever overcome it, because that's grounded in biology. We are infants for way too long. But we can, as adults, work on constantly. And then, as a civilization, we can work on creating conditions so that original stage is better dealt with. But so there is an overcoming, but it's not Nietzsche's Superman. I would say, it's more Spinoza's. But I don't, to my knowledge, but I've looked at everything, I don't think Freud mentions Spinoza. I have to mention it sometimes, but I haven't seen it.
Okay, we have a big list here, so Wendy, let me go.
Okay, so I'll ask it quickly and then if it doesn't. So I think my question is about T5 and 233. So I'm trying to understand what role the fundamentality relation is playing in your account. And so I was just wondering if, because I took from your answer to Chris that you take T5 to be Freud's statement of a fundamentality relation between, right, this sort of, this sort of story about our upbringing and how we internalize norms, and that forming a basis for how we could have this universal standpoint of willing. Is that right? And then I'm wondering what of that you're taking on in explaining the compatibility. Where is the fundamentality relation in your own in your
the categorical.
Yeah.
The fundamentality is, how do we explain the categorical? Mm-hmm. How do we explain that there is some type of demand we make on ourselves that has no antecedent condition and that trumps any, however rational, and that's a point on which I think also we would probably, but that's different, you haven't raised it, but we talked about it yesterday evening. There are types of demands we make on ourselves that would not, however, that trump any demand we make on ourselves on hypothetical premises, however rational. So in that sense, and of course, the Kantian formulation, or that categorical demand, demands of us a revolution, but in our will, that is of the same magnitude as the Copernican revolution in understanding, our relation to the world, which he was putting forward in the first critique. And that's what makes its categoricity acceptable. It's that revolution. That now we have to understand that there are claims that are claims on us that we acknowledge as binding for our will, and that emerge from the standpoint not on this, that, or other aspect of our individual life, but from the fact that our standpoint is a standpoint on, so on what? For Kant is on humanity as such. And the way I've translated it, which is already a revision, is on the world to which we belong as a whole, and on the claims it has on us, and in virtue of which we can formulate for ourselves oughts that we take to hold for all other living, rational beings who are capable of formulating such oughts, namely all other human beings. But, yeah. Does that answer your question?
That was helpful, thank you.
Suzanne?
Thanks. I interpreted you as finding a continuity between Kant and Freud's views about which mental capacities enable the moral stance. And in the case of Freud, I took you to be saying that those mental capacities are the ones that go with the features of the ego, so that they're the ones that underlie the reality principle as opposed to the pleasure principle. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about just how the mental capacities of the ego and the id, the operations of those two really differ, because you were emphasizing at one point, you said what perception is for the ego, drives are for the id, and perception is sort of having true beliefs, whereas at the end of section 2.3, you were describing the features of the ego that was learning logically consistent rules, including rules for giving and assessing reasons in general. And I guess it struck me that when the id operates, as I understood it, there is a lot of reasoning as well. I mean, there's the calculation of what would bring pleasure, and maybe there's even true assessments of, there might even be true beliefs as well. And so I guess I was wondering maybe two things. One is there some sort of, priority when we contrast the kind of mental life of the ego with the mental life of the id? Is there some priority of reasoning over sort of getting the truth, like better access to the truth in the ego than the id, or is it rather just better reasoning? And then the other thing was just which of those two things, if either, is more directly connected to enabling the moral stance? Because somehow, like self-legislation, it seems to maybe go with reasoning, like you were emphasizing at the end of 2.3. But then we have something that looks a lot like reasoning in the id too.
Wait, 2.3, what did I say?
Well, just at the very end when you were talking about, the energy of the id is enrolled in the task. This is the replacement part, I guess. Where the id was, then comes to be the ego. Enrolled in the task of internalizing to the mental life the features of the ego, the learning of logically consistent rules, including the rules for giving and assessing reasons in general.
Right.
That was the part that made me think, well, perhaps the mental capacities that are enabling the moral stance are the ones involved in giving and assessing reasons. And then I worried a little bit that the id also does something like that.
I see, okay, yeah, and actually that's related to Wendy's question. So maybe the first thing I should say is no, I don't think the id reasons at all.
Wow.
And I don't think it's Freud's view that the id reasons at all, or calculates at all. The id just, in some way, the id is our drives. And when it comes to, and that's why I was saying, let me just finish this sentence. When it comes to satisfying those drives, then we have to rely on the ego. It's the ego that will calculate the means. That was the very simple example I was giving at the beginning. Of course, you need the ego to satisfy the pleasure principle. I want to drink, I need to figure out where I will find water, I need to figure out whether that water is drinkable. The ego the reason the ego develops in the first place, this is not a mythology. This is a kind of very elementary sort of, story of the development of a rational mind. First, we have an infant who needs to be fed, who yells because he's hungry or because he's dirty and feels yucky, and then gradually, but takes a long time. That's why the emotional history of a child is so complicated. It's dependent for such a long time compared to other species. But the id, to actually satisfy the pleasure principle, needs to rely on the ego, and the ego has very, very meager means to do that. And that's why the ego resorts then to, oh, you can't do this for me. Okay, I'll do it for my son. That's fantasy. But I'm already introducing too much reasoning here. But the reaction is, can't get it, fantasize it. And the rules of fantasy are not rules of reasoning. In fact, as Freud says quite explicitly, and I think we do, Freud is really a very able folk psychologist, very good observer of what's going on. And then you can wonder, okay, what's the scientific value, what does it? But observer, certainly he does. And it's true that you can't get something, you fantasize it. My story of Madame Bovary was meant to show that. And when you fantasize, what do? Well, then there's the story of what happens in the dream, where that's where the so-called laws of primary processes really come in view in their most striking forms. And it's not in everyday daydreaming that you always get all of that. But yeah, you put together different situations that all stand for something that you're hanging on to, and you symbolize by very vivid images something that would otherwise be a rational way of thinking. So no, it does not reason. But let me just say this one more thing and tell me if it answers any of what the worries you were expressing. That infant that comes into the world with this emotional life, and essentially, first, it's attachment and dependence on the parental circle, whatever it is. Now the family structure has become much more complex, but still you have that structure where there are adults on which it depends, even if it's just one, a single mother. Other people have claims on her. And the child who is uniquely attached and uniquely dependent on her has to give her up. And has to acknowledge that this is what it is born into. It's not that to obtain this, it's born into that. That's the structure of categorical normativity. And that's what generates in it. You must have seen that happen in infants. I was also thinking of what example could I give? Okay, I can give you an example of what I think is one example. It's not a very small child. It's already a 2-year-old. But one of my nephews, so he was in a troubled family, and he was taken care of by my mother, his grandmother. He came from Lebanon, or he came from a war zone. It's a long time ago. He's now in his 30s, so that was a long time ago. The early 80s war in Lebanon. And so he was so attached to my mother, because that was his pole, that was where security was, that where emotional stability was, and so on. And then another one of my sisters had a baby, a little boy too. And I remember vividly that time when that baby we had put him in a cot in the garden under the tree. It was very cute. And we went to wake up the other boy, 2-year-old, and came down in the garden with him. And he looked at that cot, and I saw the look on his face. And he was ready to run, and I don't know what he would have done to that baby, but it would have been. And my mother yelled, "No!" And he stopped on his tracks. That was the learning of categorical. That was the learning of categorical. You could say it's just training. You do that to dogs. No, don't. But it's more complex than that, because there's a whole. That's the structure of emotional attachment and loss, giving up. That a child first learns at. That's the structure of normativity. And you learn, don't kill, don't bite on your sister, don't, and you know that there are things that have nothing to do with what you need or what you don't need, or you just don't do it. That you don't do. But then you also learn the ego. And so why do I say the energy of the id is also the energy by which you internalize? Because if you're not, that's also now psychology 101. Children need love to learn anything. So that's exactly that. The emotional attachment is the tool for convincing the child that, yeah, those rules are worth learning, and so on. But the reasoning is the ego's reasoning. Now, I don't remember why you were asking that.
You answered it, yeah.
But that satisfies you?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Excellent. Paul, if you could stand up or come a little closer so we can hear you.
Yeah, so I had a question. It seemed to me like there were two ways in which Freud can be interacting with Kant's claims about the categorical imperative. And so one of them is you could ask whether, if we accept Freud's account of mental functioning, we can still accept Kant's model of morality. And that's what the paper seemed to me to address. But it seemed to me there's also another way in which Freud could be criticizing Kant. Mm-hmm. And that would be about whether there would be some way of showing that commitment to the categorical imperative or attraction to that sort of ethical theory was either a symptom of pathology or worse still promoted a kind of pathology. I think this is actually related to what Chris was mentioning in her second point, but it seems like one of the criticisms that Freud wants to make is that the categorical imperative is masochistic or repressive. I mean, that one quote that you have, it's from the book about masochism, right?
Yeah,
So
I carefully avoided giving the title because I thought,
yeah, but I mean, I think that's one important thing that Freud wants to draw attention to. He wants to claim, he's not adjudicating the truth of these ethical theories. He's pointing out that certain kinds of ethical theories or certain kinds of ethical commitments might be expressions of pathology or might promote pathologies like repression, masochism.
because they're excessively demanding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah. Before I started thinking about, who did you have in mind with those who access those deepest truths, I had planned to conclude by saying that we should not forget that, so the lesson from Freud is that yes, we now have a moral compass that expands to humanity as a whole, that he does say, and that's a work of civilization, but we should never forget the battle of drives on which it is built, and if we forget it, it's at our own peril. And that's I think what you are saying. But you're saying more than that, because you're saying, so it's not only that we should not forget, but that because of that, the categorical imperative is just not the right formulation if we want to think about morality, because it is itself way too... is that what you want to say?
I mean, maybe this is controversial. I would have thought that Freud didn't really concern himself with the truth of the ethical theories, that he wasn't trying to adjudicate between Kant and Mill or whatever, but he's looking at what commitment to certain ethical theories does to us, right? And then that would have ethical implications depending on what theory you do accept.
Right. Yeah, okay, so no, you're absolutely right, I agree. And in fact, I don't know what Freud thought. And you're right, and I said that at the beginning, he is not interested in justification, so he's not interested in trying to find a formula by which we could justify that this is moral and this is immoral. That's not his problem. His problem, you're right, is what morality does to us.
Right.
So what I said, and I carefully avoided saying Freud thought this, I said, we don't have to conclude from this that. What Freud thought, I'm not sure, but it also depends how you understand the categorical imperative. So I guess I also have an understanding. So I have an understanding of the categorical imperative on which, first of all, we always start with our inclinations, and that's okay. And we always start with rules that are rules derived from our inclinations, and that's okay. And the only work that the categorical imperative does is stopping us on our track, a little bit like my mother stopped that little boy, but on different grounds, when those inclinations would lead us to grievously ignore what we owe to others. This is a very simplistic way of putting it. And it's true that it is a strong claim because of those two criteria of impossibility. And I do have, even independently of the Freud story, myself, I have criticisms about how Kant understands the claims of his own formulation, the claims that his own formulation of the categorical imperative make on us. So I shouldn't speak too much for Freud there, because again, as we say, it's not his problem. But when worrying for myself about, so can we still retain something from the categorical imperative in the light of Freud's certainly very different genealogy of morality and I think, yes, but it certainly needs revision. But you're right, it's not Freud's problem, and he is worried by what it does to us. Yeah.
Okay,
or
thanks.
at least I would say a certain understanding of it does to us.
We have time for one final question and final answer. Tim.
Beatrice, why Kant for Freud? The idea of universality of morality applying so broadly wasn't, certainly by 1930, wasn't unique to Kant, right? Lots of people who wrote about morality talked this way, and it wasn't new. It was second. Kant himself thought that the categoricity of moral requirements wasn't something that was novel with him. He was taking that over from common sense morality. At least I read him that way. So maybe what was distinctive, this is a hypothesis which you sort of suggested a little bit in your response to Wendy, and I just want to ask you. One thing that's distinctive about Kant is that he understood morality in relation to the problem of self-governance. And that's also what Freud is doing, although the connection is different and it's more fraught. But you've mentioned this at several points when you mentioned freedom in relation to Rousseau and so on. And it sort of came out, I thought, in your response to Wendy. But I just wanted to suggest it as a more as something that's more distinctively Kantian than the scope of morality and its categoricity.
I think that's a very, very good point. Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, I could add to that that there are very striking formulations of Freud that say the goal of psychoanalysis is to make you free.
Yeah.
Namely, in some sense, self-government. Yeah. And so that, for instance, one I can give two contexts. One is in the very early studies on hysteria, where he talked about two of his patients and said, my only goal was to give them the freedom to decide. And even in that case, to decide to remain ill or to face reality and stop. But I want to bring them to the point where they can make that decision to retreat from reality. And then there's a footnote also in the Ego and the Id, where he says, the psychoanalyst should never, it was all too tempting for a psychoanalyst to become a guru. And we should avoid that at all costs, because the only goal of psychoanalysis is to allow the patient to be free. So and that's the rise of the ego. So self-governance in a very Kantian sense, yeah. But that is indeed distinct, as the previous questioner was asking, from the question whether he found the formulation of the categorical imperative justified and justifying or not. Yeah. So you're right, and that is a different take on the question than my take on the categorical nature of morality. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but you're right, that's another dimension that's very, very important.
The universality and the categoricity make it a problem, and in particular make it a problem to how to relate it to self-governance because of the authority and the demandingness. But the distinctively Kantian element is seeing it as, one way is seeing it as, understanding it in relation to self-governance of some kind.
So of course the thing is, even though it is quite, as I cited the text, confirmed that he does talk about Kant in connection with the categorical imperative, where that does raise the questions that the previous questioner was asking, I'm not sure whether he ever mentions Kant in connection with self-governance.
Right. No. So maybe this is a false hypothesis, but
and
since
so but
I just
but
wanted to see.
it's certainly friendly to what I'm trying
Yes,
to
that's-
get. And so yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Excellent. Let's thank our speakers.